these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office, experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
For insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all, in-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths.
We hold these truths.
with Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Welcome back, everybody. So this is an interesting fact. In 1899, the commissioner of the U.S. Patent Office famously claimed that everything that can be invented has been invented. That's obviously a bad take. Didn't age very well. That being said, there's maybe a sense in our society that we could be inventing a lot more. I think we thought by the year, as 80s kids, maybe we thought by the year 2000 it would basically look like the Jetsons, flying cars and whatnot. But there's not a whole lot of differences in your I think a very basic lifestyle aside from your cell phone, of course, between now and 1995. The cars are nicer, like the things are nice. Some things are nicer, but it's not markedly different. Right. And so I have with me James. His name is not James Pocahontas. His name is not James Prometheus. It is James
like that.
Pethokoukis. James Pethokoukis.
Yes.
Thank you for being on.
Yes, sir.
You just wrote a book called The Conservative Futurist. So I think a big premise of this book is that the implication is that we're a bunch of what do you call them, techno-pessimists, or is that the right phrase?
Yeah, I think that gets right to it.
I have questions about that, but before that, let me get into your bio. You're a fellow at AEI, American Enterprise Institute. You study analyze economic policy there. Contributor to CNBC. You write the Faster Please newsletter on Substack. And for those of you on Substack, you write a bunch of articles for a bunch of people. You actually studied journalism, and you were also a 2002 Jeopardy champion. So you have a lot of random knowledge, which I'm sure this will make this conversation very interesting.
Yeah, some of that random knowledge is useful. Maybe not much, but there'll just be a couple of things.
So the big premise to this whole idea of more optimistic future in technology is that we've had a lull in technology. So let's talk about the eras of technology first to kind of set the foundations for this conversation. Tell me when they started, where our lull happened, some theories as to why that lull, and specifically in total factor productivity, what the hell total factor productivity means, and then let's go from there.
Yeah, I think there was an expectation by the end of the 1960s. There's two big eras which I talk about in the book. The first is really those immediate post-war decades, 1950s, 1960s, the beginning of the space age.
We're going to the moon.
Exactly.
And like 6 years later, we're on the freaking moon.
That's right. So there's a lot happening, like in the economy, to make you optimistic. Nuclear reactors, and there were expectations among kind of everybody, whether it was politicians or CEOs or technologists, that the kinds of advances we saw in those first 2 decades after the war, those were just going to continue, decade after decade, and certainly by the year 2000, we would have colonies on Mars. Of course, the now famous flying cars, miracle cures to chronic diseases, all these things, and as well as much faster economic growth. So we'd all be a lot richer. That was the expectation, and at the exact point.
I mean, it's kind of like like you go to Disney World. And one of the first lands he built, my wife makes me go to Disneyland a lot, so I know these things. Tomorrowland.
Exactly right.
His entire premise was actually, like, if you look at Walt Disney's history, its entire premise is built on this idea of this futurism, of this optimistic hope for innovation in the future.
Yeah. Walt Disney, who I write about in the book, great example. Very optimistic about technology, but also realistic. Like the things originally in Tomorrowland, trip to the moon, trip to Mars, and all that, those weren't fantasy. That was not like Star Wars. They thought these were things that were going to happen, and they already kind of were happening. So that's a really good example of kind of the enthusiasm. So the fact that at the exact point where we hit sort of maximum enthusiasm, everything started to slow down in the early 70s. And you can gauge that by looking at economic statistics, looking at economic growth or productivity. You mentioned total factor productivity, which is one way economists try to gauge like how innovative the economy is, like how much of the gains are from new ideas as opposed to just people working more hours or using more machines. But the ideas that are, and the technology, that's your total factor productivity. So statistically, we can like date that to 1972. But even if you don't have access to any of that, you know, we stopped building nuclear reactors. In fact, we started, you know, being very frightened of nuclear power. We basically mothballed the manned space program. So there were all, and then anyone who watches movies or science fiction movies from the 70s, it's all super gloomy. You know, a nuclear war, or it's it's mass starvation. The environmental movement in the 1970s really kind of pushed these ideas.
Yeah.
So there was a downturn.
Well, I just watched Alien for the first time. I don't know if that's gloomy though on the technology front. It's actually very optimistic on the technology front, although terrifying on the,
Yes.
the Alien front.
Right.
But anyway, go.
It's a great movie.
It's really good. I
right.
realized like I'd never, and if I had seen it, it's been so long that I don't remember it, so it's good to rewatch.
Yeah. So there was a slowdown reflected in the culture, and it's like, you know, which came first? They both kind of fed on each other. So you had this downturn in growth, a lot more skepticism about technology. We were spending as a government less on basic research. We started regulating as if it sort of didn't matter how we regulated.
Well, less as a percentage of GDP.
Yes.
Not less money though.
No, not less money, but as a percentage of GDP, considerably less. And
Isn't that kind of inevitable?
I don't think it was.
Maybe it's open for debate.
Yeah, I think like what was going to follow Apollo, right? So one, we didn't have to sort of retreat on Apollo. That was the decision.
It was a choice. Yeah.
And
I've heard, because I actually just interviewed some NASA astronauts and asked these very questions, like, because we're talking about going to the moon now, and I'm like, why is this such a unique idea all of a sudden? And we did this so long ago with the computers that were akin to very basic calculators. Pretty amazing. And look, I guess their answers were, you know, we did spend about 4% of GDP on the space program. Like that's we couldn't even fathom that. So that would be almost $1 trillion in today's dollars. And I doubt many.
I got 100,000 people working on it too.
Yeah, and like not many people would be all in favor of it. They also they said something interesting. This gets to your whole cultural change. They said those guys were taking way more risk than we would ever even come close to taking these days. Like they were just so much more risk tolerant in those days, and it's like that's why they could do it in 6 years. It was unbelievable.
And you know, this is certainly themes in the book. As a sort of a society, can we become less risk tolerant?
Yeah.
I would argue that we did. And you know, the example which kind of flows throughout the book, you know, which seems obvious, was that nuclear energy, that we retreated from nuclear based on accidents which actually didn't kill anybody.
Literally.
But,
I always tell people, there's literally, how many people do you think have died of nuclear energy in the United States? Everyone's like, I don't know. They give an answer. It's still zero. It's exactly zero.
And it's amazing. Actually, it was interesting. There was the Chernobyl miniseries, which was fantastic on HBO. And watching that, you would have thought that hundreds of thousands of people died from that. That also didn't happen. But you could see that, but that attitude, you can see it today.
Yeah.
Where when we had OpenAI rolled out ChatGPT, I think there were like cool news stories about it for about a week. Like, hey, look there's this new technology. You can write a rap song in the style of Winston Churchill. You can make crazy images. And then immediately a week later, it was like, oh, by the way, that cool technology is going to take all your jobs. And then when it's taking all the jobs, it's going to kill you. Like that, and we need to pause it. We need to nationalize it. So that sort of risk, view of risk, unfortunately, I think there's still too much of it in our society.
There might be on AI. I could argue it both ways. You know, I've had some interesting guests on this podcast on AI, doomsdayism. There's some scary things you can imagine. But moving past AI, I want to stay in the 70s for a second. I mean, so what happened in the 1970s? Are there policy changes? Are there institutional? What happened?
Yeah. So I think it's sort of a mix of macroeconomic factors and then our decisions. You know, you had all the big inventions from the late Industrial Revolution. You know, the electrification of society, you know, factories, our homes, internal combustion engine, the modern chemical industry. Like that was all pretty advanced.
It is big stuff.
These were huge changes, but by the 70s, like we kind of extracted like the huge productivity gains from them, and you know the productivity slowdown. You could see that in other countries as well, which make you think that there were some big things happening. So I think that was definitely one.
We're just reaching limits. I mean, we just got done watching the Olympics, and they're still breaking records.
But now they're like by.
But it's continuing just small improvements on the margin. Like you're never going to cut that record in half. Never.
Right.
Unless you're a robot. Like right. So
right.
I mean,
that's a really good analogy. So there were gains happening, but they weren't like early on. So. And there are some other theories. It just requires a lot more resources to come up with big ideas.
To get to that, especially that next one.
Yes, because they're sort of higher up on that sort of tree of knowledge. So I think those things, all sort of rich industrialized countries had to deal with. So I think those were definite headwinds. But like our decisions mattered, and it's a big theme that we could have a more prosperous future today had we made different decisions. And I mean, and again, the two areas I really focus on are one, devoting more resources, both a government but also private resources to science projects. But the other one, we just regulated insanely. In a very stupid way,
safety at any cost style.
No, there was
philosophy.
no cost. We assumed that there were no costs, only benefits, and there was an absolutely huge benefit to cleaner air and to cleaner water. But is there a benefit to not building any more nuclear reactors?
Is there a benefit to 10 more regulation?
Yeah. Is there a benefit to
the argument we have here all the time.
taking forever to build a highway today or a subway station and having it cost 10 times what you thought it should cost and take, like 4 times as long. And I mean, both those problems. And essentially on the regulation side, you got a lot of folks in the left who have finally sort of figured that out because there's no way they can get their green economy if you don't build stuff. And guess what?
Yeah.
We don't have the state capacity to build things, at least not in a timely, cost-effective manner. So those regulations, which are sort of still on the books today, I think was a definitely sort of sand in the gears of our economy.
Well, there's more on the books today. Maybe that was the beginning of the era.
That'd be like the worst one. But there's been like no effort really to fix them. You have environmental laws. You have laws requiring that anything that you build has to go through a million citizens groups and get their input. Yeah. And also all that stuff is still today. So it shouldn't surprise anybody that those problems still exist and that we don't grow as fast as what I think we could with all the benefits that will come from that.
Yeah, we have a bunch of examples, and it is finally starting to gain some traction as a policy discussion up here. And it is only because Democrats are worried about building, lengthy transmission lines for their green renewable energy. But I always bring up it's easy to remember, so I bring it up a lot. It's I think the 10 West transmission lines, 125 miles of transmission lines that they've been trying to build from California to maybe Arizona, like forever. And it's projected to maybe be done in the next few years. But this project started in 2016. And when you compare that to the speech to go to the moon versus going to the moon, landing on the moon, in 6 years, you're like, how the hell are we so far behind on just a basic regulatory front? So that's a clear thing we have to fix. Well, what else? I mean, what else explains our lack of flying cars?
Yeah, I think I think what's interesting is that why didn't people get angrier about this? Like we had all these huge streets like coming out of the 60s, and then again. Is maybe a shorter period of optimism in the 1990s when we had the internet boom and the economy was absolutely roaring, and the kinds of things people started anticipating in the 1990s were very similar to the 60s. We figured like that's it, we were going to reach have artificial intelligence, super smart computers. They'll help us get to Mars, and they'll help us build super efficient hydrogen cars. So that those dreams happened again. and then they petered out again.
Yeah.
And I think there's two things. One, I think we just wildly underestimated, like, how significant those barriers were. I think particularly the regulatory barriers. And I think we have been soaking in kind of this culture for a half century in which we worry about the risk of a nuclear reactor having a meltdown. I mean, one thing I wonder, I mean, I'm so enthusiastic about space and SpaceX and the huge drop in launch costs, how that created an orbital economy. But I just wonder still how our society would react to an accident that kills actual astronauts. Would we maybe say we need to shut down the rockets for a decade till we figure out what's going on? So I still worry a lot about that. But I think that sort of pessimism, which I think was reflected, again, in our culture. Listen, I think it matters that almost every vision of the future that people are presented with, really since the early 1970s, has been, it's going to get worse. That robot will kill you, or it'll put you out of work. Oh, that interesting cure, that cure for cancer, that will turn you into a zombie. Climate change, there's no way around it. Your children will live a worse life.
Yeah.
And the reason
it makes for better television.
Makes for better television, though I have.
And we have a negativity bias just as a psychological.
Yes, and we need to sort of fight it. I think fight against it. I think the culture helps, but the reason I think that's most important is that if you're going to have a faster growing economy, a more technologically dynamic economy, listen, that means there will be disruption. The kinds of jobs will come. There may be more jobs at the end, but those jobs will change. Some businesses will do great, some will fail. Some communities will be hit. There's going to be a lot of disruption naturally. So people have to understand and believe that it will be for the better. That even if their own personal lives get disrupted, their children will live in a better world, a wealthier America with more cures for diseases. They have to believe that future is possible. People have been told over and over, well, that's just not going to happen. It's going to be worse. And if the robots don't get you, the climate will. So what are we even doing here? Why bother with the faster economic growth? All it's going to do is, cause me to lose my job, then my kid will get a worse job. Mm-hmm. So I think that sort of pessimism really operates against people who are trying to, I think, solve problems. So that's what this is all about. It's about us taking control of our future by, partially through technology, solving problems. And guess what? Some of those technologies, they also might cause problems, but they will solve those problems too, and we move forward as a society.
Well, I mean, so we talked about the technology side and some well understood reasons why we may not have advanced technologically speaking since the 70s, but on the economic measure of productivity, I'm not sure we understand that one very well on why that has slowed down. Was there a...
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that some people would still like to debate the causes of the Great Depression. I think we have a pretty good idea. The causes of that slowdown, again, lots of reasons. We talked about sort of the late stage industrial revolution, having to use more resources, to climb that tree of knowledge. There's lots of other reasons. Some people say, well, maybe it was because World War II scattered all the scientists in Europe and delayed their progress, because that was such a heart of sort of Western progress. So maybe World War II played a reason, or maybe it was the Drug Control Act in the 70s, because look how many of these guys in Silicon Valley, Steve Jobs, they took mind-altering drugs, and maybe that somehow led to them being creative people. I don't know. I tend to doubt that one. But there's lots of reasons. But I think whatever the sort of other exogenous external reasons are, I have no doubt that those decisions to make it harder to build in the real world,
yeah, for sure,
and the share of our society, our resources toward scientific research, I think those all matter.
Well, again, that's not technology. I'm talking about productivity. So productivity is a function of how many people you have working and what they're producing with each hour of work.
Yeah.
And technology plays a part in what they produce with each hour of work. And you need more people. So I guess I'm answering my own question because I know we have less workers than we used to. Just to compare.
Right. So you want people to be more productive, right?
Yeah, you want people and more people.
Yeah.
And we have less workers compared to seniors that are in retirees.
So they could be we can make our workers, they can work longer, they can be better trained, they can have more and better equipment to use. And when you add all that stuff together, there's still something that's not captured. And there's different names for it. They call it the residual. Economists like to say, well, that thing that's not captured is innovation. It's new ways of doing things. It could be new technologies, or it could be a new technique of
process.
some sort.
Yeah.
So that new process and that has slowed, and that's half of all productivity growth, which means it's half of a good chunk of economic growth going forward.
This is an interesting excerpt on the 1970 Geothermal Steam Act. Because I've heard from a lot in industry that there should be a lot more excitement over geothermal energy sources. Right? We've gotten pretty advanced in our drilling techniques. And there's
Thanks in part to the fracking revolution.
thanks almost entirely in part to that, right? Does it mean we want to drill into Yellowstone? I don't know. Maybe. Man,
It would be the first place.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the footprint looks like. I think there's other places we can drill into, but it just gets to this. I always, on energy specifically, I always get frustrated by the obsession with renewables because I'm like, they're not going to get any more efficient. They're not going to get any more energy dense. They're not going to get that much more easy to build. The materials that are required to go into them will remain the same. I think we need to leapfrog that idea a little bit, and we are. I mean, there are obviously companies looking at geothermal and better and more advanced nuclear technologies. But why bring that one up? Is that again, it happened in 1970? So is this part of the onset of this sort of? Problem?
I mentioned the book because geothermal companies still talk about it.
Yeah.
Which is a good example of these things having a very long lifespan. And we don't go back and take a look, like whatever purpose we wanted this to serve, is it still serving that purpose, or is it preventing us from doing what we want to do? But energy is such. Listen, if I was going to come up with a grand theory, it's like if you have greater human intelligence, so we're smarter, and you have lots of energy, and that operates in an environment of freedom where people can take risks and be rewarded for their risks, you're pretty much home with creating a more prosperous society.
Yeah.
So, and whether the modern version of that is, greater digital intelligence, lots more, I think, clean, cheap energy, geothermal and nuclear, plus making sure that operates in a policy environment where where entrepreneurs are rewarded for taking their risks. If you get all those things right, I think you're there.
Where does globalization play into this narrative? I mean, that's another thing that perhaps changed since the 70s. But you would think, you would think it would have at least had a positive effect on. I think it did on general growth. Obviously, it has negative effects on specific aspects of American society. Displaced by a globalized economy. But does that play a part in any of this narrative? And I'm not sure if you review it much in your book.
Yeah, I think making sure that that people and ideas and technology kind of flow around the globe is good. I mean, we want to attract talent here to the United States. I once was listening to Elon Musk, and he said, if you want to do something great with your life, there's no better place to do it than the United States of America. And I think woe be to us the day that's not true. So I think that's important. I think it's important that companies compete with each other. If a U.S. company is competing with a German company, well, we're capitalists here. We think competition pushes companies to be better, more efficient, adopt new technologies, adopt new way of doing things. So you want companies to be in competition with each other, and you want to make sure that your economy is exposed to that competition. It's not protected from that competition, which you get a lot, I think, for a lot of sluggish, unproductive companies. That to me would be a step backward. So that kind of economic openness and building upon the traditional strengths, I think, remain strengths, and there's nothing that has changed that would say we shouldn't do that, that we should somehow create a wall around the United States, or our companies are competing, or that maybe don't we have enough smart people here? Do we really need more talented people? And listen, the easy case, that's immigration, is to make the case that, well, sure, we want the nuclear scientists here. We want, people bring lots of different skills. I like the fact that also people come here, maybe they're not, an AI scientist, but they are hustlers and they are strivers and they're trying to build something and create a better life for themselves and certainly for the family. I mean, that part of our national fabric, that's probably pretty important. So I think, a lot of the globalization argument is around the China shock. I think there was no way you were going to keep 1.5 billion people out of the global labor market indefinitely. But that shock is over. And I would hate to think that all our policies going forward are going to be based on somehow imagining that we can reverse that or talk. It's like a sunk cost. That happened. Could some things have been done differently? Perhaps, but there was always going to be an impact. What do we do going forward?
Yeah. Well, okay, that leads to the final question then. What are the set of solutions that, maybe break us out of this, the technological lull that we've been in?
Yeah. I think there are a number of things. One, I think maybe the most important thing, make sure as a society we agree, this is that we want to do this, that we want to go for, that we think growth is worth it. And I think if we get lucky here and maybe we get an AI boom and some growth, it'll be easier to make that argument. During the 1990s, we had greater inequality. People worried about inequality. We had greater inequality in the 90s, but there were no riots or demonstrations in front of Wall Street or in front of tech companies because the economy was growing fast. Literally all boats were rising. We could use a period like that. That would help. But I think on the policy front, I think we want to spend more federally funded research. We want to make sure we have a tax code that benefits private research because both are important. They do different things. Both I think are super important. I think we really need to either radically reform or get rid of some of these sorts of 50-year-old environmental rules that are only there to create paperwork and don't have actually any real impact. I think that's extraordinarily important. And this sort of happened toward the end of the book, the AI emergence. I think we really don't want to screw that up. I think we really need to think about how we approach regulating the internet in the 90s, which was a very cautious, do no harm approach, because people too often think about AI as somehow taking their job, when it is certainly going to create far more jobs, and as a general purpose technology, make everything else potentially easier, from new medicines to new materials. So I think not screwing that up would be a massive plus going forward.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we will. I think most of Congress are still trying to wrap their heads around what screwing up would even mean.
We need a less efficient Congress on this. We need gridlock, inertia.
There's plenty of gridlock, so no worries there. There's certain worries on AI that seem kind of realistic. If AI's purpose is to mimic human behavior, mimic human speech, if it's generalized AI, my question is always, well, what kind of human does it decide to mimic? What kind of access does it have to your bank accounts or email? Does it? That's the apocalyptic view of it. I think it's not so much that robots will kill everybody, but that.
Of course, the banks will also be using AI to defend against those malicious actors. People often don't think about that.
Well, not so much hacking banks, but it's the interesting example brought up to me was, okay, you've got a person who works in a lab and has access to a scary thing like a COVID virus or something, and then they get an email with a list of their entire family, or they get an email saying that they're bribing them or threatening them, and it's AI talking to them and trying to wreak havoc on. I don't know. There's science fiction novel stories. But that's where the pessimism.
I think it's telling that that it's very easy for us to come up with these kinds of scenarios because again, we have 50 years of those scenarios a part of our collective memory. The scenarios where like that doesn't happen, where this technology somehow solves a major problem, we don't have that like cultural reservoir. I mean, there's some examples. I think there's actually more examples of late of that kind of culture. And I talk a lot about science fiction, and I think it's important because I think if you cannot imagine a better future then you're just not going to take the risk to build it.
Science fiction is definitely split down the middle, the pessimist versus the optimist.
I think
There's
it's split down the middle like the optimist, and then everything else is pessimistic. I mean, when I looked at it, it was very difficult for me to find optimistic. I mean, you have Star Trek, and then there's a massive drop-off.
Okay.
Absolutely massive. But there are a few shows. If I can give like a recommendation on this, is I would recommend, there's a great show called For All Mankind. It's a wonderful show, and it looks at what happens if the Soviets got to the moon first. Then what happens? It's alternate history, and it's like the space race, but we just kept on racing. And it looks every season's a different decade. Like, what does the world look like? And it's the world by the time you get to the 2010s, is it a utopia? It's not. But I think it's a better world and a kind of a richer America, and an America that can solve more problems.
That's interesting. Yeah, I started watching that. Maybe I'll dive into it. Well, you talk about the labor market, and I can't tell if just because I only have summaries of this, I couldn't tell if you're like it's saying this is a problem or not, or that we need to expand upon it. But basically, licensed occupations, or is the problem simply that it's too difficult to get some of these very basic licenses to stay, style hair or something?
Yeah, that kind of stuff. I mean, that should be like sort of basic sort of fixes like we should be able to make. Like making sure that if people want to be in the labor market, that we make it as easy as possible. Yeah. I mean, there's so many of those kinds of, little things. Do we make it difficult? Do we make it hard for people to leave companies? We want that kind of like labor market mobility and fluidity, I think is really important. And it's only become more important, I think, in an economy that is hopefully will be growing faster, will be creating new jobs, more jobs. And it's going to be up to I mean, I don't predict like these are like the 10 jobs of the future. I have no idea. Why? Because the entrepreneurs have yet to figure them out. So when the entrepreneurs figure out those jobs, I want to make sure people can take those jobs and aren't encumbered by sorts of regulations which are only there maybe to protect the people who are incumbents or whatever. Yeah. So that's like that should be an easy.
That's the political. It should be, but it's the political difficulty of occupational licensing reform is like all the people in the occupation lobby pretty strongly against any kind of licensing reform. They don't want it to be easier to do what they did. They went through a certain standard. It's like I can relate to it a little bit. It's like us saying like, you know what, we need more Navy SEALs, so let's just make the training easier. It shouldn't be as brutal as it is. Let's make it easier so that then we'll have more SEALs. That's obviously comparing apples to oranges a little bit, but not really, because the basic idea is that we have a higher standard and that we need to keep that higher standard. But the question is, and that's a political question, is that reasonable?
Well, I think if we lowered the Navy SEAL standard, there'd be an impact. There doesn't seem to be an impact.
Yeah.
Like you cannot say that these regulations on hairdressers has somehow resulted in better haircuts or less people dying in the chair from bad hair. So you can see the book covers a wide range from hairstylists to moon bases. So we cover it all.
Well, then what are you excited about? Is there anything that you're predicting that's around the corner that we should be excited about?
I'd say that the one thing which I think still continues to sneak up on people is just how important it is that we've been able, thanks to SpaceX, to put things now into orbit at, a 20th of the cost that we could a decade ago. So lots of those sort of space age dreams fell apart because of economics. They were all just super expensive to get anything into space. That has changed and it continues to change. So all of a sudden the economics begins to make sense, and that will manifest, I think, initially this decade with multiple space platforms of companies which may do a lot of things, science research, try to create products up there that you can't down here. Yeah. And I think eventually that opens up to
really interesting things there. Like you can grow crystals a certain way at zero gravity and things. there's this whole market for like the pharmaceutical industry to do their manufacturing in space, which now government doesn't even need to be paying for this anymore.
And we'll find out, and then
they've done it.
makes
It's
that
happened.
easier, as well as then making planetary exploration a permanent moon base. People worried about they want more solar energy. What about solar energy beamed from space? Well, that may actually be economically viable to beam that energy from space using materials that we could mine from the moon to create these platforms, providing low cost solar energy anywhere in the world where you wouldn't have to build giant solar farms, all over the United States or other places. So that space is actually space on probably what's happening with nuclear fusion. Also, I think sneaking up on people for kind of advances being made there.
Yeah, and the geothermal too, I think.
I mean that gets so little coverage versus the potential.
Yeah, and there's very immediate problems solved from once you got energy cheap and abundant for as long as you can think about, you can stop worrying about a major part of your economy and just focus on.
It really is sort of the straw that stirs the drink. You get that part solved, steady, reliable, abundant. I think clean's important. Cheap energy. I think it's hard to screw up an economy at that point.
Yeah.
Though we may.
We're always trying.
As President Nixon once said, it doesn't take a genius to ruin the American economy.
No. Yeah, and I won't even get into what the
by the way,
potential ramifications are these next few months.
By the way, Richard Nixon once said that he wanted to build 1,000 nuclear reactors all across this country. A plan that fell apart. So, people have been thinking about this. Maybe it's time to take some of those big ideas and actually make them happen.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know the cost of that back then versus now. It's I wish he had. I'm not sure what the obstacles he ran into back then. I guess that was sort of the height of the counter-nuclear activism, which has only just recently started to recede. I mean, very, very recently, because
that's a huge plus. That is really an amazing development. I think that has really begun to fall apart.
Yeah. Facts eventually went out, maybe. Thanks, Jim, I call you Jim. James.
Fine. Thanks for it.
Yeah.
This has been great. Thanks for having me on.
It's a really interesting book, and it's been out since when?
It's been out since last October.
Okay. Great. And you can get it on all the
Still
places.
as timely as today's headlines.
Yeah. You can still get it on anywhere you get books.
Absolutely.
Amazon, et cetera. Thanks for being on.
Thank you.
Cool.